Hello everyone and welcome to another video. Today's video is going to be my favourite books of all time. Now, this is an update video. I did actually film a video that covered my favourite books about 2 years ago, but I said at the time that I was worried that that list was going to eventually become outdated, and of course it did. So this is pretty much just from scratch all of my favourite books, and there are quite a few differences on this list than the books I had on the list 2 years ago. I tried really hard to keep this very concise, but I still ended up with like 23 books. These are my favorite books of all time in no particular order because it was difficult enough trying to whittle down just 23, much less ranking them in actual order. The very first book on this list is a non-fiction book, and it is Sapiens by Yuval Noah Harari. This book is pretty much the history of the human species. It looks at our journey from being like hunter-gatherers and where we came from, how we built civilizations. It covers human history in the most fascinating and beautiful way, and is also probably my favorite non-fiction book of all time. If you're interested in human history, if you're interested in like where we come from, why we have religion, why we have certain economic things, this book just beautifully weaves together the most interesting information in the most concise way possible. The second book on this list is Pachinko by Min Jin Lee. I read this book a few months ago. It tore me apart. It was so heartbreaking and beautiful. It is about a young woman named Sunja who lives in Korea. She's about 16 years old and she becomes pregnant. She ends up rejecting the man who got her pregnant because he's not a very nice man, and then she's married by a Christian pastor who then takes her on this voyage to Japan during the time of the Korean occupation. This is a time when it was very hostile for Koreans to live in Japan. And this story is like this intergenerational epic that follows her life and the life of the people around her over the course of many years. It is one of the books that I wept reading, and it's just so beautifully written. And I was like writing down quotes from it the whole way through, and it was just a stunning novel. Book number 3 is The Lost Flowers of Alice Hart. I read this as a library book just after we moved back to Australia after living in Japan. But The Lost Flowers of Alice Hart is a story about a young woman. She starts off as a child in the story. Her name is Alice Hart. It sort of follows her life, and it follows the story of her overcoming her trauma. There's 3 very distinctive and brilliant settings in this story. It's sort of set coastal Queensland, I think, from memory. And then there's like the sort of country setting, and then there's like the outback of Australia. This sort of very traumatic thing happens to Alice when she's very young, and she goes to live with her grandmother. And her grandmother lives on a native flower farm, and they use the language of flowers to sort of communicate, and she ends up using the language of flowers to process her trauma. And it's a story that is so atmospheric. The imagery is just beautiful. I almost missed this one. Thankfully, I have my notes, so I did not forget, but I had to go run to my bookshelf and grab this. Number 4 on my list is The Graveyard Book by Neil Gaiman. If you've watched a lot of the videos on my channel, you will have noticed that over the last sort of 2 years, I started reading Neil Gaiman books, and then I absolutely fell in love with his books. So in addition to this book, I also have 2 other Neil Gaiman books on this list, and they are Coraline and Instructions, which is a picture book that's really lyrical and beautiful by him. Kicking it off with The Graveyard Book, I read this just after I got my tonsils out. I filmed a vlog of me reading it, and fundamentally this is a story about growing up and going off into the world. The Graveyard Book is a story about a young boy named Bod, who his name is short for nobody. Effectively, Bod's whole family gets murdered by this scary antagonist whose name is Jack. And Bod, who's a teeny tiny little toddler, sort of toddles out the door by accident and then up the hill and finds refuge in a graveyard. And so the ghosts of the graveyard let him in, and they end up protecting him from this antagonistic, murderous figure. But yeah, overall, a beautiful middle grade story. I love this so incredibly much, and I think it is a beautiful, brilliant book. And then the next 2 by Neil Gaiman, honestly, I could chuck a whole bunch of his books on this list. I'd also include The Ocean at the End of the Lane, which is a brilliant story, but like, can I really have 4 Neil Gaiman books on this list? Like, that doesn't seem fair. And then the other 2 are Coraline. Coraline is a story about a young girl who is in this flat, which is within a larger house. It's a very creepy old house. She's on her school holidays. Her parents are working. They're not really paying attention to her. She gets very bored, and then she discovers a hidden door in the house. She goes through, it's a portal fantasy, and then she meets her other mother, who is this very demonic, scary lady with buttons for eyes. That book is pretty much a novel about learning that to be brave is to feel scared and do the brave thing anyway. And then the final one by Neil Gaiman is Instructions, which again is a picture book. I listen to this picture book, like the audio version of it, so often. It is pretty much a cute little picture book that is just the instructions for like growing up, but it's like very fantastical, and it's written in the second person. It is just so lovely, and I love it very, very much. The next 2 books on this list are by Angela Carter. This is another one where if you watch my channel a lot, if you watch a lot of my videos, you will know that I never shut up about Angela Carter. So the first one I'm going to talk about is The Magic Toy Shop. This brilliant little book is a novel about a young girl named Melanie whose parents die in a plane accident. It's a coming of age story. It's a Bildungsroman. She gets taken out of her like quite comfortable childhood in the countryside in England, and she has to go live with her creepy, estranged Uncle Philip, who owns a very scary, uncomfortable toy shop. I've mentioned this before. Please don't go into this expecting it to be a fantasy. There's no like actual magic in this. It is a gothic story. It's a beautifully written book. It's quite short. There's quite a bit of allegory in this book for Bluebeard, the fairy tale. And then the next Angela Carter one is The Bloody Chamber, which another book I have spoken about a lot on this channel. The Bloody Chamber is a collection of fairy tales. They're not like fairy tale retellings, but they're sort of like original stories that are very heavily inspired by fairy tale. The first story in here, the titular Bloody Chamber, pulls from the fairy tale of Bluebeard, and I had never read that fairy tale before reading this version, and oh good God, it was creepy. Very, very decadent writing, very flowery purple writing, but this is the stuff that I really, really, really love. The next book on this list is not by Angela Carter, but it is about Angela Carter, and it is Edmund Gordon's The Invention of Angela Carter. This was another library book I borrowed and ended up just absolutely loving. It is a biography on Angela Carter's life, and I learned so much about her backstory, her influences, her time she spent living in Japan. There were so many cool, amazing things that she did that are like weird little crossovers with like my own life, because I lived in Japan, she lived in Japan. She went to the University of Adelaide to be a teacher. I studied at the University of Adelaide. That was one of like the personal reasons I liked the book. But yeah, overall just a really, really compelling and well-written biography. I thought it was really strong. I loved it. Book number 10 is The Handmaid's Tale by Margaret Atwood. I thought it was beautifully written. It has some very potent imagery. You could tell that Margaret Atwood sourced from a lot of history in writing the story. If you don't know anything about The Handmaid's Tale, it is a dystopian, speculative sci-fi work. It's quite upsetting to read, honestly, and it was written, I think it came out in like 1986, and it is terrifying how relevant this story feels even now. Like, it feels like it was written last year. So in the plot of the story, we have this like main character whose name is Offred. That wasn't her original name, that's the new name that's been given to her. And she is a handmaid, and the handmaids in this country, which used to be the United States of America, but because it's a dystopia, the country's sort of fallen apart and there's a new regime. Handmaids sort of exist to bear the children of the elite of this society. So Offred gets placed in a house with a wealthy governor and his wife. Effectively is there to get pregnant with his child and then give her baby away, because for some reason the wives of this society cannot become pregnant. And it is her story of what it is like to go from being a person to becoming a non-person in this incredibly oppressive system. It was so believable and strong and brilliantly written. I just love this story, and I thought it was really quite harrowing in a very important way. So I thought it was excellent. Okay, moving on to Never Let Me Go by Kazuo Ishiguro. This is another like speculative sci-fi sort of story, and this is an excellent novel that I read when I was in year 12, and I friggin' loved it. I cried very much. This is a very harrowing, heartbreaking story that makes you think about life, morality, and that just because we can do something doesn't mean we should be doing something. Every time I try to talk about this book, it's so difficult because I can't tell you the thing that makes this amazing because you need to find out while you're reading it. But effectively, it starts out with this character whose name is Kathy H. And she is remembering her life, and she sort of goes back in her memory to this time when she was in boarding school, and it starts off as like an English boarding school novel and follows on from there. There's a lot more to this story than that, but just trust me, it is amazing and excellent. Oh, the next one on my list is the old favorite Harry Potter. I love this story. There's never a point where I'm not going to love this story. This will always be the most important story to me because I kind of learnt to read off of these books, and I read and reread these stories throughout high school. They were the thing that got me through high school, and the reason that I love writing and the reason why that fantasy is my favorite genre. And I'm sure you all know the story about Harry Potter, but yeah, these books will always have a special place in my heart. It makes it a bit challenging when you don't ethically agree with some of the beliefs of the author. Okay, I just dropped this book on my fiddle leaf fig, that's fine. Okay, you know what? I was not going to include this book on the list, but I'm bringing it back. The two books by Haruki Murakami on this list are Norwegian Wood and The Wind-Up Bird Chronicle. I do also quite like Killing Commendatore, which I think is a really good entry-level Haruki Murakami text. It has a lot less adult themes in it. There's some like really confronting stuff in Haruki Murakami's work. So if you don't like really graphic sex scenes or like pretty violent stuff, but you want to read Haruki Murakami, I'd probably start with Killing Commendatore. From memory, I think that one's pretty safe. But in terms of his other books, the books I like the most by him, they are, again, Norwegian Wood and The Wind-Up Bird Chronicle. A few facets I find kind of problematic, particularly with this one. However, despite that, the imagery in this story is so beautiful. It's so beautifully written. Norwegian Wood is a story about a young man named Toru Watanabe. He is sitting on a plane and he starts remembering his university days, and these were during the 60s, during a time when there was a lot of like student protests in Japan, and he sort of remembers these like quite traumatic things that happened, the first girl he fell in love with, and relives in his brain in the past tense what happened during his university years. And then The Wind-Up Bird Chronicle, which is more of a speculative story. It's a lot of like dream sequences and tunnels and weird, beautiful, magical realism in that particular story. It's very dark. You cannot expect a very structured plot that goes from here to here. It's, a lot more weaving, and you sort of just have to read this book slowly for the joy of reading it. Sorry, the plot of The Wind-Up Bird Chronicle is that this man living in Tokyo, he's married, his cat goes missing, and he's like looking for the cat, and then his wife goes missing, and it's sort of how his world starts unraveling, and these really creepy antagonistic forces who are coming in, and then weird stuff starts happening, and it's set in Tokyo during the summertime, and I love the imagery that Haruki Murakami uses. It is so impactful and atmospheric. Okay, moving on. The next book is Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. This book is upside down. This book is the book that invented science fiction. It was written by a 16 to 19-year-old girl. The jury's actually out on how old she specifically was when she wrote it. So yeah, Frankenstein is the story of Dr. Victor Frankenstein. It has been pointed out to me in the comments of quite a few videos, didn't actually graduate, so maybe shouldn't be called Dr. Victor Frankenstein, but I think they were a bit more loose with the term back then. Victor Frankenstein effectively is in university. He creates a monster who doesn't have a name. He's called Demon or Wretch, but the monster is not Frankenstein. He's never called anything specific, but he's animated from like grave robbed body parts. Victor realizes what he's done. It's an abomination. It's the worst thing in the world. and sort of his life entirely falls apart from there. This is a framed novel. It's a story within a story within a story. What I found really interesting about this book is that it has really potent and beautiful natural imagery in it. There's a lot of like nature versus industry and God versus man sort of allegory in here. And there's a lot of like Christian allegory as well, with like Dr. Victor Frankenstein like playing God and creating Adam, which is the monster who then turns into Lucifer as he becomes more evil and does evil stuff. Yeah, beautiful story. I wrote like 2 essays on this during uni. Can you tell? I focused on liturgical imagery. Yeah, really good, really beautiful story. I love it endlessly. Book number 15, which isn't actually number 15 because I went and added books in. It's probably number 16 or 17. It is Educated by Tara Westover. This is another nonfiction story. It is an autobiography. I was so moved by this story and just thought it was absolutely excellent. This is the story of a young woman who grows up in more rural America, but she is the daughter in a large family of Mormons, if I'm remembering that correctly, who believe the ends of days are coming. They're preparing for Armageddon. They're very religious. They don't believe in school or doctors or these sort of societal structures that keep people safe. And so this is Tara's story of her childhood and what she goes through and how she sort of gets herself out of the situation and claws an education for herself despite never going to primary school or high school. She graduates from, I think it's Cambridge University or like one of the Ivy League universities, and it sort of goes through the breakdown of her relationship with her family and how she got out of the situation. I was listening to the audiobook and I just couldn't stop listening. I loved it. It was beautiful, so interesting, and it was really good. The next one is Howl's Moving Castle by Diana Wynne Jones and also Charmed Life by Diana Wynne Jones. These are middle grade kids books and I love them so incredibly much. Howl's Moving Castle is my favorite Ghibli film. I love it very much, and this book is stunning as well. If you like the movie, please go read the book. There's a lot of context you get about the world and about Howl specifically that you don't get from the movie. Did you know he's actually Welsh? Like this is actually a Portal fantasy and he is Welsh, and the first time I read that part of it, I was like, oh my god, because I thought it was like entirely secondary world. I didn't realize that this was, yeah, very cool. Love this book. I think what I really like about both of these stories the most is the like magic systems and the world building. Howl's Moving Castle is about a young girl named Sophie Hatter. She's the eldest of 3, which means she's prone to bad luck and misfortune, and she is cursed by the Wicked Witch of the Waste to look like an old woman and to feel like an old woman. Goes out into the wastes where she becomes the cleaning lady to a very flamboyant and sort of self-indulgent and kind of selfish wizard named Howl. I love the characterization in the story and it is just so very good. And then Charmed Life is about a young boy named Cat and his sister Gwendolyn. Their parents die in a boat accident. Cat survives because he clings onto Gwendolyn. And she's a witch and witches cannot drown. And then they eventually go to live with this wizard whose name is Crestomancy. And they go to his extravagant house and sort of get immersed in this culture of witchcraft, and there's a lot of magic and it's just so very good. The next book on this list is Anne of Green Gables. I read this last year. And was blown away by how much I loved these books. I'd never read them before. Her parents die and she becomes an orphan. She has a really bad situation where she gets fostered out to all of these families. But eventually Marilla and Matthew Cuthbert adopt her into their family. This is set in Canada in the late 1800s, I think. There's the most beautiful natural imagery in this story. I think it's so beautifully written. I think the characterization is excellent. We are almost there. The next one is All the Light We Cannot See by Anthony Doerr. This book won the Pulitzer Prize for Fiction in 2015. Okay, so my camera just stopped working. There was no way that the battery was going to hold out for the entire video. It is about a young boy named Werner who sort of grows up in Germany. His parents died, he's an orphan, and also about a little girl named Marie-Laure who lives in France and she is blind. And it is about how their stories sort of intersect during the Second World War. This story is not told in chronological order. It jumps back and forth over the course of quite a few years. Very, very beautifully written. I love Anthony Doerr's writing. I just think he is such a talented author. And I absolutely love this story. It's a very, very good war story if you're interested in World War II. The next two books are by Virginia Woolf, and they are Orlando, which is this book here, and A Room of One's Own. A Room of One's Own is it's not really a novel, it's more like an extended essay, and it is pretty much Virginia Woolf's rumination on what it's like to be a woman and to be a writer. And she goes through this concept of like, what if Shakespeare had a sister who was just as talented? Would she have been able to publish those plays? Probably not. And then we have Orlando, which is a story about a person who lives over the course of several hundred years. He starts off living in sort of like the Elizabethan era, and then he goes on to change genders, so they change pronouns to she, and then they live until like the sort of high modernist period beginning like 1910 or 1920. I can't remember what decade the story actually finishes in. It's a really interesting, weird biography of obviously not a real person, but very ahead of its time in terms of gender ideology. And then, cool, I think we're on to the last two books. These two are non-fiction books because I love studying and I love literature. I was just gonna chuck in my two favorite literature textbooks. This one is the Anthology of Classical Myth. Pretty much it's the translations of Ovid and Plato and Hyginus and all of these like classical authors and the versions of their myths when they wrote them. So like, for example, if you want to read about the myth of Atlante, you can read the primary sources and you'll get several different perspectives on how that myth worked and how the myth was different from these different sources. Read this when I was studying mythology at university, just thought it was a brilliant, wonderful book for reading the primary sources, so I recommend it all the time. Then, The Cambridge Companion to Fantasy Literature. This is a great entry-level scholarly book to read if you're getting into fantasy lit and you want to start analysing fantasy literature. This is a really good one. It is edited by Edward James and Farah Mendelssohn. Farah Mendelssohn is a very, very important scholar in this area. She's worked on a lot of really important scholarly articles and chapters on fantasy literature. I used her work all the time when I was doing my postgrad because fantasy literature was actually my research area. Pretty much just covers a bunch of different interesting topics, gives you really, really good context. Okay, in the end, I think we ended up with like 26 books. But yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed this video. I hope it was enlightening. I hope you found some books that you would be interested in reading. Please let me know what books you guys absolutely love. And I know that a lot of you guys have very similar tastes to me, so please let me know what your favorite books are. Thank you guys so very much for watching. I know this is a very long video, but I hope you liked it. Take care, and I will see you next time. Bye-bye.